This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Sometimes a painting's complexities and issues are disguised or masked, but other times we can see right through them. This portrait of a French noblewoman came into the studio with lots of problems, none of them particularly well disguised. The painting was absolutely filthy, grimy and dirty from top to bottom, and of course, there was a massive hole right in the center. To say nothing of the series of tears running down the right side, corrupting the canvas, threatening its structural stability. This painting was heavily distorted, with dents and ripples and waves, creases, and other incidental damage. But underneath all of this grime, well, we can see that there's something special there, as evidenced by this lacework and the sensitivity with which it was painted. The flowers in her hair also exhibit a skill that lets us know this artist was talented and this sitter wealthy enough to afford them. And though the problems are quite evident, and the solutions relatively straightforward and predictable, employing them and achieving a successful result may in fact be a little bit more complicated than it first appears. Without a doubt, that hole is a major problem, and even though I know how to fix it, it would be great if I could just snap my fingers and drop into its place something that would just fit and work. You know, just like with Squarespace. So you've taken advantage of Squarespace's beautiful, flexible, mobile-friendly website templates, thousands of them, to create a portfolio to showcase your artwork. And then you realize that you need to be able to sell that artwork and invoice people for that artwork and accept payments. And all of these things are now holes in your website. Well, with Squarespace, filling those holes is easy. Just takes one click. From a robust commerce platform that manages everything from inventory to sales, customers, and shipping, to a built-in invoicing solution that allows you to invoice your clients, simplify your workflow, and manage your business. And finally, Squarespace's payments system, where with a few clicks, you can start receiving payments right away. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Work on Our Lovely Lady begins by separating the canvas from the support. And in this case, the painting is stretched not to a stretcher, but a strainer. And the difference between a stretcher and a strainer is the ability of the stretcher to be expanded. You see, the joints, the corners, are free-floating. There's no glue or nails like there is with a strainer. So, by using keys, we can expand the stretcher support and add tension to the canvas. This painting is on a strainer, which is a much simpler, cheaper, and easier support, but it doesn't allow us to add tension to the canvas. Now, generally, this would be a problem, but I have some tricks up my sleeve, and you'll see those later. After removing all of the rusty and deteriorated nails and tacks, I can simply lift out this support and place it aside. My focus right now will be on the painting. I'll get to the support later on. There is a lot of accumulated dust and dirt and particulate behind the strainer support. And I'm going to be removing it by disrupting it with a little brush. This canvas is pretty delicate, and so I want to make this grunk and grime as free as possible. And then I'll come back with my vacuum. I'm using very, very light suction here just to lift this stuff off. This is not a terribly powerful vacuum. If I used something like a shop vac, it would probably suck the canvas up and tear it into many pieces, and that would be a really big disaster. Once all of that stuff is removed, I'll check and then I'll take it back to the hot table for the first of several treatments. This first treatment is going to relax and flatten the canvas. It has a lot of planar distortions, waves, ripples, bumps, and from those tears. And I need the painting flat. So by adding moisture, heat, and pressure on the table, I can flatten it, much like ironing a shirt, just with more control and precision than using a standard iron. One of the problems with using an iron to do this is that you can't cover the entire painting at the same time, so you have to move in sections. And while you're working on the first section, the second section is distorting. Then you move to the second section and the first section distorts, and so you end up chasing your tail. While the painting is under pressure, I'm going to take my bone folder and I'm going to work some of these areas that are standing up. And you can see, with just a few little passes, it's now flush and smooth. After bringing the table up to temperature, allowing the painting to sit under pressure for a little while, turning off the heat and allowing the table to cool to ambient room temperature, I can remove the painting from the envelope that I made and transfer it over to another table where I will press it under weights for a day or two to allow it to lose any residual moisture and acclimatize further. Once the painting has been allowed to sit, I can start thinking about the major repair that I need to do, and that's replacing that missing hole in the center of the canvas. I'm going to choose a bunch of canvases from my canvas stock. This is old canvas that I saved, and I'm going to test it against this painting to see if I have a weight and a weave that matches. Unfortunately, I don't, and that is a problem. But while contemplating what to do, I had an idea. I'm going to harvest this little piece of the tacking edge that's already detached and use it to make the fill-in. Because it's the same canvas, it's the same weight and weave, it's got the same ground, and frankly, it's just a tacking edge. This is a completely acceptable solution. There is no content on this tacking edge, there's no paint, there's no inscription, it's just a piece of canvas. And if we can use it to save the image, well, then we owe it to the painting. Now I do have to cut 3 little strips, but that's not going to be a terribly complicated problem to overcome. Once I have everything aligned, I'll trace the opening onto the canvas with a pencil, and then I'll start cutting it out. I need this to fit flush into that opening. Now instead of using my scissors, which I normally would, I'm using a blade on a piece of acid-free foam core. The scissors were just too aggressive, and because this canvas is so brittle, it really just crumbled. So by using a very small scalpel, I can just chip away at the edges. I'm not really cutting as much as I am using the scalpel as a chisel and carving away what I don't need. But once I'm done with that step, I can inlay these pieces into the void, and you can see they fit pretty well. And that's going to mean I have to use less fill-in, and we get a more natural matching texture when we do the retouching. And that is important. But I'm not satisfied just leaving those pieces there before I do the lining. They're going to move. I know this from experience, and I would rather avoid that issue on the front end than dealing with it on the back end. So I'm taking a piece of washi kozo, this is Japanese mulberry paper, and I'm tracing around the area where I put the inlays. And then I'll use my fingers to just tear that shape. And I'm not cutting it because I want a frayed edge. I want the fibers to be loose because that will help soften the transition from canvas to canvas covered by this paper. If I cut it, that edge could transfer to the face of the painting, and then I'd have another problem. So much of life is figuring out how to solve one problem without inadvertently creating another one. Using a little bit of conservation adhesive on the canvas, I'll lay the paper down and then work it into the canvas. I'm going to come back and really make sure that it's flush. I don't want it standing proud at all. And then I'll take a piece of silicone release film and felt and press it under weights until it's dry. The adhesive takes a few hours to dry, and then I can come back and remove the weight, and we can see it's really smooth and flush, precisely what I wanted. And now I can take the painting over to the back and I can prepare it for the interleafed lining process. Because this has such a huge tear and a big hole, there's no way that I can do anything to support this painting other than lining it. And the lining process is where we add a new canvas to the back of the original. But because this has a big tear and a big hole and it's incredibly brittle, I'm going to be adding a piece of flat spun nylon gossamer. This does a couple of things. First and foremost, it compensates for the difference in the canvas texture and the PET film that's going to go on the back. Secondly, it makes removing my work even easier in the future. If somebody ever has to take this lining off, this piece of flat spun nylon gossamer will help peel off all of those layers and take a lot of the adhesive with it. So I'm trying to think about the next conservator and make their life a little bit easier. So whomever you are in 100 years, you're welcome. I'll trim off the excess because it doesn't need to be there, and then I'll prepare all of the lining materials. The PET film goes on. It's been trimmed to fit just precisely. Then I'll tack it in the corners with my iron just to make sure it doesn't move and the registration gets corrupted. And then I'll lay it onto a new piece of Belgian linen canvas, which has an adhesive film already tacked on. Again, I'll tack it in place, check to make sure that there's nothing on the surface, and then go back to the hot table where the lining can commence. With the painting now finally clean, I can start filling in those losses. And here, my use of the tacking edge to fill in that big hole will receive judgment. It will either have worked wonderfully or not, and I will have to figure out another approach. I'll start by filling in all of these little tears where the paint has flaked off and chipped off, and before the fill-in medium dries, I'll come back with my hands and just lift off as much of it as I can. By doing it now, it's less work later on with the swab and water. There are some areas on the painting where the texture of the paint, the impasto, is built up a little bit more, and I simply can't leave that area flat because your eye will catch that. So I'm building up some of that area with the fill-in medium, and then I'm coming back with a brush to add some texture so that it matches the surrounding paint. I mentioned that once this is dry, I'll come back with a swab and water and remove all of the excess. This is critically important because I only want to fill in the area where the loss is. I don't want any of this fill-in medium on the original paint. So by lifting it off, I can ensure that I've only added material where material was lost. Now, before I can return the painting to its strainer, I have to do some work on this. I mentioned that earlier on, and we're going to keep this strainer. But as you can see, one edge is pretty gnarly. That's not going to cut it. So I need to correct it. And that starts at my table saw, where I will rip down this edge, creating a smooth surface. I'm just taking off about the width of the blade, maybe 1/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to glue on another piece of wood right here so that I can use that to create a new edge for the tacking surface. This is going to be a permanent fix, so I use standard wood glue and my finger to smear it around. I want to make sure that the glue has good contact on both surfaces. And then using a bunch of clamps, I'll clamp it in place. And I'll clean off the glue now while it's wet because it's just a little bit easier than doing it later. I also have to clean the glue off the table because I made a big mess, but such is life. After a little while, when the glue is dried, I can now rip down this edge to its proper size. The piece of wood that I added on was oversized, giving me plenty of material. And now I can run it through the table saw and remove what I don't need. And you can see that it's only a little bit, about 1/8 of an inch, but now it's straight and ready for the next step, which is going to be adding a little lip which wasn't present on this strainer beforehand. This little lip makes sure that this strainer doesn't touch the canvas. It allows some airflow, and it's the right way of modifying this support. Instead of using clamps, I'm just going to use some tape because it's a little bit easier, and I have to do this on all 4 sides. Not terribly complicated, but this is work that if you're going to conserve the painting right, you may as well do this. With all of that work done, it's now time to marry the support and the painting. It's not terribly difficult here. I just have to align it, make sure it's where I want it, and then start tacking it. Now, because this painting had an interleaf, that was the PET film that I put between the original canvas and the new canvas, this canvas isn't going to deform with humidity changes. It's effectively immobilized. So the use of a strainer here is completely okay. If this just was a regular canvas, we would need to put it onto a stretcher, and this strainer would be only a temporary solution. Now, I'm not using a pulling pliers here to add tension because, remember, the canvas can't stretch. Once it's on, I'll remove all of the excess canvas, and I'll begin tidying up the back, using smaller tacks just on the back to make sure that all of this extra canvas doesn't fray and get in the way. This is one of my favorite things. I don't know why, but I just love making sure that the back looks as crisp and clean as the front. Kind of feel like it's a demonstration of the care that goes into all of the painting. Once the painting is fully stretched, I can now prepare it for retouching. And that begins by adding an isolation layer onto the painting surface. And this is why I do it. You can see just how washed out the colors are. If I retouched to those washed out colors, when I applied my varnish, it would look different. So by applying this layer of resin first, I can saturate up the painting and make sure that my retouching will match the fully saturated colors. After the retouching, it's now time for the final varnish. And this is where I get to control the sheen and add a final protective layer to the painting. We can make the painting matte or super glossy or somewhere in the middle. My clients generally trust me because I've probably varnished 30,000 paintings, and I think I have a good eye for what's going to look right. But if I get it wrong, the varnish can easily be removed and reapplied. Once it's applied, I'll brush it out to give it a little bit of a texture as the solvent evaporates and leaves the resin. This is a technique that I think works really well and gives a beautiful effect. With all the work done, we can now finally take a look at who she really is and what she's supposed to look like. Free of all the surface grime and everything that was on the painting, we can see the beautiful colors. We can see the delicacy of her lace. We can even see her expression. And what we can't see is the gigantic hole and tear on this canvas. Those were so distracting, it was almost impossible to see the painting. But now with them repaired, well, we can just enjoy the painting. And that's what the artist wanted. Her expression comes through now that we can see the beautiful tones on her skin, and she's free of all of those pockmarks. And as we look down to where the hole was, well, it's gone. It just looks normal, which is precisely what we wanted. And as for rendering a judgment on my use of the tacking edge, well, I think it was the right call. We can't see that hole, and if you didn't know it was there in the beginning, you probably wouldn't think anything of it. And under a raking light, as we head down to that hole, well, it's still invisible. And so that, I think, was the right move.